Hi, I'm James Tansey. I'm the Provincial Insect and Vertebrate Pest Management Specialist. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about grasshoppers. An important element of evaluation of grasshopper populations is an appreciation for the diversity of these animals. We have about 85 species of grasshopper in the province, only about 4 of which are typically pests, and it has less to do with diversity and of course more to do with the numbers of individual species. So the vast majority of grasshopper species are not problematic in crops. They're happily munching on plants that are not economically important. However, the 4 pest species that we have can be devastating pests, and what we've seen this year, particularly in southern regions and central regions, especially in the south central and southwest, are very large populations of grasshoppers. Although many of these have been highly localized, where they do occur, they have been very damaging. We saw with the great heat that we had this year a rapid development, a rapid emergence of nymphs. So that is first instar nymphs from the overwintering eggs. All of the pest grasshopper species in the province overwinter as eggs. We had terrific conditions last year for oviposition or egg laying, and really warm late summer temperatures, so they could speed through their development and get to a point where they're very, very hardy over the winter. They're well developed as embryos in those eggs in the spring. We had relatively warm conditions relatively early on, and they could move through their development quickly, from hatch to molting to the first instar to second instar, third, etc., up to adulthood. So early emergence of nymphs and damaging populations of nymphs are relatively unusual this year to see second and third instar nymphs causing economic damage and requiring the application of insecticides, but we certainly did see it in a number of crops. I mentioned before there was portions of the province that were more affected than others, and the southeast less affected, although we did have some hot spots, and the northeast we actually had populations of damaging grasshoppers at relatively high numbers, which is relatively unusual given the history of grasshoppers in those regions. So I mentioned before we got 85 species of grasshoppers, only about 4 of which are typically damaging. Okay, pictured here is the lesser migratory grasshopper, and you can see with the blue arrows some conspicuous features of this animal as adults. Of course, adults have wings. In this case, you can see the stripes on the hind femur, coupled with a mottled stripe on the forewing, and then a red hind tibia. The red hind tibia isn't necessarily a distinguishing character, but it is common in the species. Okay, the next animal is Packard's grasshopper. This is a large one. These females can be very large and highly fecund. That is producing a lot of eggs. Relatively uncommon this year, although we did see some hot spots in the northeast. Characteristic of this animal are the blue hind tibia, as indicated by the arrow, and the stripes on the pronotum, or that plate right behind the head. You can see a couple of yellow stripes on there, very characteristic, in addition to that pale coloration. Nymphs as well, typically unpatterned and green as they get to be mature nymphs. This is two-striped grasshopper, the most prevalent pest species in Saskatchewan. You can see the characteristic 2 stripes extending from between the eyes along the top edge of the forewing as the wing is at rest. Highly characteristic, in addition to the black stripe on the hind femur, and you're seeing that in all of the nymphal stages and the adults as well. Yeah, and finally, clear-wing grasshopper. Characteristics of these ones include this camouflage pattern on the forewing when at rest. You can see that there is striping that's somewhat similar to two-striped grasshopper, but it doesn't continue to the eyes, and what are called carinae, or these little ridges on the pronotum. You may need to get very close, or even use a magnifying glass to see those, but a very distinctive character of this particular grasshopper. So for the forecast for next year, we still haven't conducted the survey. We lean on SEIC to conduct a relatively extensive survey across the province and use that data to make our prediction for next year. However, based on the conditions in July that we've seen to date, very warm and dry conditions, highly conducive to egg laying and to the survival and development of grasshopper eggs. So we are likely, without a change in the weather, looking at large grasshopper populations again next year. Okay, so illustrated here are the 2022 and 2023 grasshopper forecasts, and I mentioned that we rely on SCIC to collect this data. You can see for the 2022 grasshopper forecast, or this was the survey that was conducted in 2021 to make predictions about 2022, we had some hot spots, but overall populations were relatively patchy, relatively moderate. We saw a dramatic increase in the 2022 survey leading to the 2023 forecast. We're still awaiting the survey to be conducted for our 2024 forecast based on 2023 data, but based on conditions for egg laying right now and some of the regional populations, I think we can anticipate continued grasshopper pressure. And finally, we rely entirely on permission to access sites for our surveys, so not just the ones that we talked about today, but for a number of different insect and disease surveys. And we encourage people to sign up for our survey system, and we will contact them, secure permission to access their lands. We need permission to access, and we can continue to gather this data for what I believe is valuable work.